If you saw my video about the coming great demographic implosion or the future conflict about the domination of Eastern Europe, you probably noticed that my views about the mass immigration to Europe from Africa and the broader Middle East are mostly negative. That means that I perceive the large-scale and irreversible change of the ethnic fabric of Western European countries as an ultimately detrimental process for the region. There were, as could have been expected, many enraged comments under these videos, accusing me of putting far too much emphasis on the issue and that I was blowing it out of proportions. And there were also many comments supporting my views and sharing my concerns. In this video, I would like to address, at least partially, both viewpoints. I am to explain why I think that immigration to Western Europe is a highly problematic issue that is, and likely will stay, a net loss for the countries that it concerns, all things considered. But I would also like to address some views of many people that agree with me, since there are a lot of overblown expectations on their part too. Mostly regarding the pace of the potential growth of European Muslim or ethnically non-European populations. If one wants to constructively argue against mass immigration, it is not desirable to use arguments not grounded in serious demographic analysis, since it undercuts the validity of seriously thought out argumentation. I am talking about statements like Western Europe will have a Muslim majority by 2060 and similar ones. You can see them quite often, but they are not based on serious demographic projections. That being said, I also often marvel at how carelessly some people can dismiss the gravity of the issue at hand. The crucial thing to understand about large-scale immigration is that it is one of the few policy issues that, once they happen, are practically irreversible. If a country enacts a badly thought-out tax, industrial or educational policy, it might produce serious negative and long-term consequences. But you can always change it back, or adjust it to better fit the needs of your country. And most of those policy changes are reversible, with more or less difficulty, given enough time. But not mass immigration. Once you change the ethnic composition of a country or even a city, that is basically forever. Once the ethnic change reaches a certain level, there is no way to roll it back. That does not include what we would perceive as a crime against the humanity, which is obviously unacceptable. That is why it is truly jarring how carelessly, swiftly, and without sufficient public debate these changes happened in many European countries. The root problem of the debate on immigration stems from the persuasion of the modern Western left that all the people in the world are basically the same. Sure, they differ in the level of opportunities that they are offered in life, due to the cruel lottery of where one has been born. Still, all you have to do to remedy that is to allow them to relocate to a place where opportunities are plentiful, and they will behave in the same way you are used to from Westerners in the same conditions. But that is a profoundly utopian way of thinking about the world. There are great psychological differences between populations, based on the specific histories of different regions, their religious backgrounds, family systems, levels of kinship intensity, or individualism. Sure, immigration certainly can work, even large-scale immigration, but it is a delicate issue. You must calibrate the specific characteristics of the source societies and the host countries, and adjust the pace and quantity of the immigration streams. There is a Chilean-Swedish politician and economist called Mauricio Rojas. He was a socialist activist in Chile who fled to Sweden in 1974, following the military coup and the new Pinochet regime's subsequent persecution of leftist activists. In Sweden, he slowly changed his views from socialism to economic liberalism. During this process, he thought a lot about the reasons why welfare state socialism is working so well in Sweden and why it usually is a complete dumpster fire in Latin America that has almost brought civil war to Chile. When talking to Swedes, they usually prescribe the failures to the wrong implementation of this or that specific policy regarding the functioning of workers' councils or some other procedural detail. But Mauricio Rojas, having intimate knowledge of both Chile and Sweden, felt that the reason was deeper than that. He found the answer in the particular nature of the Swedish nation. Basically an ethno-state comprised of Swedes of Lutheran confession with a strong tendency towards egalitarianism, a big emphasis on working ethic, dislike of ostentatious manifestations of wealth and luxury, and a taste for rustic simplicity stemming from the homogeneous peasant origins of the Swedish nation. He concluded that you could hardly emulate the Swedish socio-economic model in a country with vastly different traits, for example, Chile. Why am I talking about why Chile could not adopt the Swedish socio-economic model? Because it nicely illustrates how fragile and peculiar different societies are, and that psychological and cultural differences matter greatly. Sure, people are, to a certain extent, all the same. They are the same biological species, can procreate with each other, can all achieve great accomplishments, and experience the same pains and sorrows, as well as happiness and joy. Every human life also has deep inner value, but there is also a profound cultural and psychological diversity that should not be underestimated. In the case of Europe and its immigration-related troubles, the comparison with the United States is very telling. Both regions are on the receiving sides of massive immigration streams altering their society's demographic fabric. In the case of America, the largest source of immigration is Latin America. In the case of Europe, it is mostly the Middle East and Africa, and the immigrants are often of Muslim confession. But the outcomes differ wildly on the different sides of the Atlantic Ocean. The sheer quantity of migrants coming to America is inevitably causing problems of administratively logistical nature, especially in the border regions where the people are exposed the most. And there also is crime connected with Latin American immigration, mostly through the Mexican cartels, preying on the millions of illegal immigrants in the US that cannot deal with it through police due to the danger of being deported. But the Latin American immigrants do not threaten the fundamental American way of life and, what is most important, precisely follow the integrational playbook that was usual with the previous large waves of immigrants into the United States. For example, Italians, Jews, Irish, or the Poles. It takes 3 generations in America to transit from a newcomer living in an ethnic neighborhood and maybe not even speaking much English to an American citizen that usually does not speak the language of his ancestors. And the American identity is his primary self-identification. Latinos in the United States have less money, higher labor force participation, more authoritarian family structure, lower divorce rates, higher birth rates, more frequent, primarily Catholic, church attendance, and a higher military enlistment rate than the average among native-born Americans. That basically means that Latino Americans are very similar to white American working-class people from the 1960s or 1970s. This process is not taking place with Muslim immigration to Europe. The example of military enlistment is an interesting one. I think that military service is a good sign of person's identification with his new homeland, since the person is willing to risk his life to defend its interests and territory. As I said, the military enlistment of Latinos is somewhat higher than that of native-born Americans. While they comprise 18% of the population, their proportion among military members is 16%, so minimal discrepancy. In opposition to that, there were over 3,300,000 Muslims in the UK in 2018, or 5.1% of the population. According to Wikipedia, the British Armed Forces have active personnel of over 190,000 people. So, if the number of Muslims were to correspond with their share of the UK population, there should be circa 10,000 Muslims in the British Armed Forces. It might be argued that it is only natural that immigrants or their descendants are not joining the military as much as the indigenous Britons that are often brought up with the knowledge of a great British military tradition. But on the other hand, there is a significant 13 years difference in the median age, which was 28 years for British Muslims versus 31 for non-Muslims in 2016. So there is a substantially larger cohort of young Muslims in military conscription age in comparison with the native population, which could somewhat rebalance the discrepancy. So, how many Muslims served in the British Armed Forces in 2018? 650. Just to paint the whole picture, 750 Muslims that were British citizens went to Syria to fight for ISIS a couple of years ago when ISIS was a thing. These differences between the success of integration on the different sides of the Atlantic are not incidental, since they stem from the specific interaction of the host and source societies. As always, it takes 2 to tango. Since Latin America is a Christian continent and the United States are still a significantly Christian country, there are very few frictions created by civilizational incompatibility. In opposition to that, the conflicts stemming from the interaction of largely secular post-Christian Europe with very pious Muslim populations are obvious and include the position of women in the family and society, the role of religion within the society, the approach to the freedom of speech, in conflict with the Muslim sensitivity to real or alleged offenses to their beliefs, and the conflict between the cultural liberalism of European countries with the social conservatism of Muslims. The concept of religious belief that is a private matter of every citizen is relatively alien to Islam, but it is one of the cornerstones of European social order. Many scholars have also pointed out widespread violent conflicts in the lands where Islam borders other civilizations, be it in India, Africa, Israel, or Southeast Asia. This is by no means to suggest that the local Muslims solely instigate these conflicts, since they often do have complex roots and the responsibility might lie on both sides. Nevertheless, that Muslims can turn violent in attempts to justify what they pursue as wrongdoings committed against their religious beliefs is also visible in Europe. The examples are plenty, but we can mention the murder of the French teacher Samuel Paty, whom an Islamic terrorist beheaded for allegedly showing his students the Charlie Hebdo's 2012 cartoons depicting the Islamic prophet Muhammad, the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attack in which two Islamist gunmen forced their way into the Paris headquarters of Charlie Hebdo and opened fire, killing 12 as retribution for the publication of the mentioned caricature. Or the wave of terrorist attacks with hundreds of casualties during the concurrence of the migration crisis with the Western military campaign against ISIS. While mentally deranged individuals often perpetuate these attacks, their denunciation by the European Muslims is often less enthusiastic than Europeans would like it to be. Quite often, one can see reactions in this sentiment. Sure, it is bad to kill people. That is an overreaction. But, on the other hand, they should not have offended the Prophet, so it is also a little bit on them. However, to be fair, what kind of incentive does modern Europe give these people to accept the European culture? These migrants come from a proud civilization, with many reasons to feel that it is on the rise, at least in the form of demographic expansion, and are confronted with a host society with a profound crisis of its cultural identity. People are drawn to cultures that are ascending, on the rise, cool and self-confident. The modern Euro values that are the pillars of Western European mainstream politics, be it progressivism in the cultural questions, environmentalism and secularism, all of them manifesting on the backdrop of quickly diminishing European economic, geopolitical and cultural influence over the world, are not really that attractive to the migrants and their descendants. They largely do not want to make them their own. I do not blame them, to be honest. Modern European culture is just not that compelling. There is an interesting Swedish movie called Play by director Robert Ostlund. The movie follows a group of young boys of African and Middle Eastern ancestry in Sweden that are bullying two boys, one ethnically Swedish and the other of Asian ethnicity. It is established that the two bullied boys are from standard Swedish middle-class backgrounds, while the bullies are likely from some of the problematic neighborhoods. They spend the whole day harshly abusing the two boys in plain sight, and nobody around, on the streets or on public transportation, does anything about it. You can see that there is a fear on the part of the majority population that stops it from intervening against the bullies. This fear has two aspects. The fear of physical skirmish with the children who, even though still just boys, are not shying away from violence, and the fear of being accused of racism. At the movie's end, one of the bullies stole something from some other kid in the street, and the victim's father intervenes, holds the thief, and tries to hold him accountable. He is immediately accused by a bystanding woman of treating the kid unacceptably, alluding to the disadvantaged immigration background of the kid. For me, the movie greatly showcased one of the Western Europe's major problems with integration. The migrants often come from very culturally masculine backgrounds, with significantly patriarchal authoritarian family structures. There are also often very strict criminal laws in Muslim countries. It means that when you misbehave, the punishment is significant, whether from the authority figure within your family or the state. However, when confronted with the comparatively pampered treatment in Europe, they do not interpret it as a showing of goodwill, but as a weakness. And they naturally push the boundaries to find out where the limit is. Even the young boys in the movie subconsciously understand the rules of the game. When every attempt to show some strict, tough love approach that could command respect is met with immediate accusations of racism or Islamophobia, it creates a paralysis of sorts. This is then interconnected with economic dislocation that combines the rejection of European values with the status of a social underclass of many non-Western immigrants in Western European metropolitan areas. Here we can again compare with the United States, which still possesses the mainstream culture that migrants subconsciously integrate into within a couple of generations, including immigrants from Muslim countries. However, while the United States is one of the best countries in the world in integrating newcomers from all over the world into the majority culture, it was never able to properly integrate its Afro-American minority, which still represents an undeniable underclass of the American society. It is a fascinating contradiction in the heart of the American project. I will not get into the subject in detail, since it would require a video of its own, and there are much more qualified people to discuss this issue. But even I have to admit that certain policies of the American state, for example, vastly different criminal punishments given for the possession of crack cocaine, mostly used by black people, and powder cocaine, mostly used by white people, even though the drugs are both more or less equally socially dangerous, is just hard not to see as a manifestation of systematic racism. But the problem is that the story of European migrants is in some ways similar to that of Afro-Americans in the United States. In the United States, the mechanization of southern agriculture in the early and mid-20th century sparked a great migration of Afro-Americans from the rural south to the northern cities. However, they arrived when the era of the largest expansion of American Rust Belt heavy industries was ending, contributing to their underclass status in northern American cities, where you can find crime-ridden Afro-American inner-city neighborhoods in basically every one of the well-known large cities. Something similar happened in Europe. Many of the migrants from Middle East or North Africa came to Europe to fill positions in heavy industries lacking sufficient manpower in the post-war economic boom. In the 1960s and 1970s, Turks in Western Germany had higher labor participation than native Germans. But the heavy industries were largely outsourced out of Europe from the 1980s on, as in America. It took away the economic bedrock of the migrant communities in Europe. Neither the African Americans nor the people of migratory origins from the Middle East or North Africa in Europe managed to really take root in the new service-based economic models that replaced the industry-based economic models of previous decades. In Europe, it also coincided with the rise in Islamist political ideology within the Muslim world in the last couple of decades. When we compare the levels of unemployment among the non-EU born and non-US born immigrants in the EU and the US, the difference is again stark. The unemployment rate for foreign-born persons in the United States was 5.6%, and for the US born it was 5.3% in 2021. While in the EU it reached 13.5% for non-EU immigrants and 8% for the native-born people in 2021. But that skews the regional differences between the EU member states. The figure for non-EU born unemployed reached 23.7% in Sweden, while for the native born it was 7%. 13.6% in France, while for the native born it was 7%. 13.5% in Austria, while for the native born it was 8.65%. 14.75% in Belgium, while for the native born it was 6.3%. And 8.75% in the Netherlands, while for the native born it was 5.75%. If we look at the eastern flank of the EU, which does not receive almost any immigration from the Middle East and Africa, the picture changes again. In Czechia, the figure for non-EU born unemployed reached 2.4%, while for the native born 2.8% in 2021. In Hungary, the figure for non-EU born reached 5.3%, while for the native born 4%. And in Poland, the figure for non-EU born reached 5.5% in 2019. The 2021 numbers were not available for Poland. And for the native born, it reached 3.3%. So, while the unemployment for non-EU born immigrants is higher than for the natives in all the examined countries, it is sometimes close to double or triple the unemployment rate of the native populations in Western Europe. Meanwhile, the figures in the United States or the Eastern EU flank are fairly close. It is a question if it is caused by the much more robust welfare states of Western European countries compared to the US and the poorer Eastern EU members. But it is undoubtedly true that the robust welfare states might give migrants the wrong incentives. Another important factor is something I would call the level of cultural sophistication of the national ethos of different societies. Becoming an American is comparatively easier than becoming a Swede, Dutchman, Frenchman, or Dane. The settler countries like America, Australia, and Canada were created by immigration, plain and simple. Sure, the cultural and ethnic core of the nations was made by immigrants from particular sources, but the idea that you are initially from someplace far away and came to look for a better life is the cornerstone of the American project. During the centuries, even if it was always with some resentment from the natives, the ethnic and cultural core of the American society, created mainly by Englishmen, absorbed vast waves of immigration from northwestern Europe, Germany, Scotland, Ireland, Italy, Poland, or Eastern European Jewish diaspora. Even though the newcomers were almost always considered not proper white people by the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant core, they were all integrated with time. The process is now taking place with Latin American and Asian immigrants. American emphasis on individualism, with man's house is his castle attitude towards many things, makes it easier to become part of the society. Pay taxes, say that you are grateful to America for allowing you to build a better life, and show the flag on the 4th of July, and voila, you are an American. The English language also helps a great deal. European nations are different. Europe is historically a much more tribal place, and most nations, consciously or subconsciously, have an idea about their nation stemming from some ancient tribal group of people speaking the same language. The cohabitation of the many nations of the continent and their simultaneous development and competition resulted in much higher exclusivity and historically reclusive attitudes towards others. There are much more sophisticated cultural codes that are harder to penetrate. The languages are less convenient than English to learn and use. European states, of course, integrated many people of different ethnicities in the past, but they were mostly from other European nations with close cultural backgrounds, and in incomparably lower numbers than in America. Migrants in Europe often do not feel accepted by the majority society on an intimate level, even if everybody around is much too polite to say something that could offend directly to them. They often speak about the cold and the distance they feel between themselves and the members of the majority ethnicity. There is frustration caused by the feeling of not being entirely accepted by their new European homelands, but not being Algerian, Syrian, Nigerian or Pakistani either, because they often never left their French, Swedish, Dutch or UK city and are thus somewhere in between those identities. It is easy for them to accept radical visions of Islam, mainly on the internet or in the local mosque. The fascinating thing about the mass immigration to Europe and the consequent change of the European ethnic makeup is that nobody really wanted it to happen, and the public opinion was against it basically from the start, which never really changed. After the Second World War, governments in Britain, France, Benelux and Scandinavian countries set up guest worker programs to fill the manpower holes in their industries during the post-war economic miracle period. In all the named countries, there was a broad consensus that the numbers of immigrants would be low, only the amount that the industry needed, and if this need to fill the gaps in the workforce ceases to exist, the immigrants will just go home. If you would at the time suggest to an Englishman or a Dutchman that there would be many cities where white Dutch or white British people would be a minority in 50 years, they would either be very disturbed or think you are a fear-mongering conspirator. Sure, the demographic pyramids of almost all European countries still somewhat resembled an actual pyramid. Thus, the need for the often repeated arguments justifying the alleged necessity of mass immigration, mostly the argument that the pension systems and welfare states cannot function without a supply of labor, that the demographic reality of the European countries in the late stages of demographic transitions is unable to produce, were nowhere to be heard back then. But once the first communities are established and create a support network for the newcomers, immigration becomes substantially easier, and the low-key process of renewing industrial contracts and family reunification permissions started a chain migration that brought numbers of immigrants to levels that would certainly cause a public riot if somehow revealed to European populations back in the 1960s or 1970s. Today, it is standard for most Western European countries to have around 1/4 of the population of immigration background. In England and Wales, the population identifying as white British in 2021 accounted for 74.4%, less than 58% of live births, and constituted 36.8% of the population of London. Around 7% of inhabitants of England and Wales were of other European ancestries, and the rest were of non-European origin. In the Netherlands, people of Dutch ancestry comprise 74.77% of the population, people of other European ancestries 10.7%, and people of various non-European ancestries the remaining 15%. In Belgium, people of Belgium's ethnic background were 66% of the population and only 25% of the population in Brussels. Of the non-Belgian third of the population, around 55% are of different European backgrounds and around 45% are of non-Western backgrounds. We have to consider that Brussels is the bureaucratic center of the EU, so armies of foreigners somehow connected to the EU are living in the city. In France, the situation is complicated since the French state does not allow statistics based on ethnicity, so nobody really knows the real ethnic makeup of France. But according to the estimates based on sickle cell disease, which affects only people of non-European origin, screenings, around 40% of new births in France was of at least partially non-European origin. In Sweden, people of Swedish background with 2 Swedish parents constituted 65% of the population, with the rest being about half European in origin and half non-European. In Germany, circa 74% of the population is of ethnically German background, and the rest is split into approximately half of European and half of non-European origin. In Austria, 73.6% of the population is of non-immigration background. So, the picture is surprisingly consistent across northwestern and German-speaking Europe. Between a quarter and a third of the population of these countries are of immigration background, with circa half of the immigrants being of European and half of non-European backgrounds. But there are 2 additional factors to keep in mind. First, the populations of immigration backgrounds are not spread equally throughout the population, but are almost completely concentrated in the biggest urban areas. That means that while people of immigration background usually consist around 25 to 30% of the population of the whole country, it is already more than a half in many of the largest urban areas, including London, Birmingham, Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Amsterdam, Brussels, and Geneva. Also, when you check the population pyramids of native people and the people with immigration backgrounds, in this case especially immigrants of non-European ancestry, it looks like population pyramids of a completely different countries. The population pyramids of the native population have the well-known inverted age structure characteristic for major populations in later stages of population transition, with stagnant or declining numbers. Contrary to that, the population pyramids of the non-European populations are more similar to the countries of their origin and are much younger on average. These 2 factors mean that the demographic profile of the main urban areas versus the smaller cities and countryside differs and will differ dramatically. This process is then further supported by an increasing white flight that has been happening in many metropolitan areas in the past decades. The white flight happens because people prefer to live around other people of their ethnicity and cultural background. That has been proven by many sociological pieces of research. Thomas Schelling described it as a domino effect of sorts. Imagine you have a 100% ethnically native neighborhood. Suddenly, some people of different ethnic background move in. The area is now 95% ethnically native. The thing is that the tolerance threshold of every person is different, which means that for the vast majority of the inhabitants, the 95 to 5% ratio is completely fine. But there is a small percentage, let's say 3% of inhabitants, for which it is too much, and they decide to move out. So, the ratio is suddenly 92% to 8%. But that suddenly hits the tolerance threshold for another couple of people, for which 95 to 5 was fine, but 92 to 8% ratio is too much. And they move out. That moves the ratio a couple of percentage points lower, suddenly breaking the tolerance barrier for another group of people, resulting in a cascade effect and eventual segregation. Even the very liberal people that declaratorily support immigration and virtue signal their openness and welcoming of ethnic change in their countries usually live within predominantly ethnically homogeneous white neighborhoods. This is especially true of many celebrities, journalists, or public intellectuals, who often live in rich, safe, and ethnically homogeneous parts of cities, while condescendingly denouncing the anti-immigration views of the working classes living in neighborhoods that are actually affected by immigration. The hypocrisy is blatant. In large American cities, there is a well-established pattern of racial segregation. In and around the downtowns, rich, posh, hip neighborhoods are ethnically predominantly white. Around the downtown is a circle of much poorer, less safe, and predominantly black or non-white inner-city neighborhoods. And around them is another large circle of, once again, white, safe, and rich suburbs, from which people commute to work in offices downtown. A similar pattern might appear in European cities. People tend to grossly underestimate the historically groundbreaking nature of the whole process. Within the context of history, it happened incredibly fast. Almost all of the states I mentioned before were either completely ethnically homogeneous or, if they comprised more European ethnicities, basically 100% European in origin. Within a lifetime of a single person, this changed forever. People sometimes argue that Western European countries were always nations of immigrants, but that is just a blatant lie. Before World War II, Western Europe was, together with North Africa and East Asia, one of the most ethnically homogeneous regions in the world. Ethnic change on this scale could be maybe compared to the migration period between 300 and 800, when Germanic and Slavic tribes were moving westward throughout Europe and settling in new territories. But even the Great Migration period lasted for hundreds of years, and the populations living in the territories where the newcomers decided to settle down were usually not very happy about it. I should address some of the most often used arguments justifying mass immigration. They are usually economic and connected to population aging, a well-established problem in Europe. European populations are aging and declining, and the working age populations are expected to decline substantially. Without immigration, this process would be even more severe. For many countries, mass immigration is the only thing that stands between them and population decline. Someone has to work and pay taxes to fund the pension systems for the elderly native populations. But there are several problems with this line of thinking. First, some countries with the most profoundly changed ethnic makeup do not have that bad population pyramids. When you look at the population pyramids of the native populations in Sweden, Denmark or the UK, they are not that bad. The situation would likely be even better in France. Sure, there would be aging issues, but they would be much less severe than in the case of Germany, Italy or Poland, since the northwestern European countries never experienced the ultra-low fertility of under 1.5 children per woman. Their aging issues could be dealt with by immigration on a much lower scale, ideally sociologically thought out and aimed at bringing in particular age groups and lacking professions. The situation is completely different in German-speaking Europe, where fertility has been at ultra-low levels for almost 50 years. The decline and aging would be significantly worse without immigration. But it is also not a solution. Either the immigrants' fertility rate is as low as that of the natives, as with the European immigrants, or converging within a generation, as with properly integrated immigrants from different backgrounds. In that case, it is just a temporary fix, since the migrants come in productive age, work, and can contribute to the system to pay for the pensions of the contemporary retirees. Still, a couple of decades later, they become retirees themselves. Then, they will need to be supported by new young workers, which would, again, be brought from abroad. It becomes a never-ending cycle of importing more and more people until the members of the native nation are inevitably a minority in its own country. At this point, you might argue that I do not see the difference between a nation-state and an ethno-state. I certainly do, and I completely agree that nations can integrate different ethnicities. But the issue is scale, pace, and quantity. The pace and the quantities of such immigration need to be modified for the integration to happen. If a country like Germany, with rapidly declining population, continues to import such quantities of immigrants that it would fill the demographic holes in its workforce and keep its population stable, it is just too much. If the newcomers are not surrounded by the majority culture for sufficient amount of time, the integration is very complicated, since more of their co-ethnics is coming and bringing the customs of the country of origin with them. The other option is that the birth rates do not converge. The immigrant populations continue to have a lot of kids, and it might help the aging of populations on paper. But it is also a clear sign of a lack of cultural integration, which will inevitably lead to cultural clashes in the future. Another problem with the economic arguments for mass immigration is that several sources show that non-Western immigrants are, on average, a net loss for the financial system of European countries. In Denmark, such a study was done by the Ministry of Finance. It showed that immigrants from the Middle East, North Africa and Pakistan are a net loss for the system for their whole life, while every other group of immigrants becomes a net benefit for at least a part of their productive life. In Sweden, similar results were found by the Swedish economists of Iranian origin Tino Sanandaji. In the Netherlands, the share of immigrants in the low-income bracket on welfare income support is much higher among immigrants from non-Western sources. For example, the vast majority of immigrants from Somalia, Iraq or Afghanistan are on income support. In the UK, University College of London came up with a report saying that non-European migrants living in Britain were a net loss of £120 billion between 1995 and 2013, while EU immigrants had a net contribution of £20 billion between 2000 and 2013. But even the Central and Eastern European immigration does not come without problems. Many Eastern European nationalities are significantly overrepresented among the criminals of countries in Northwestern Europe, Germany or Austria, with people of different Balkan nationalities being the most prominent in this group. One of the reasons why many Eastern European countries are quite safe today might be that many young men who would cause trouble at home are living in the UK, France or the Netherlands. But with that said, from the cultural and economic point of view, Eastern European immigration, even if it also breeds resentment, is objectively less problematic than non-European one. The migrants are culturally closer, more often employed, and can be more easily expelled from the country if needs to be. Just to clarify, no one normal has a problem with Nigerian programmer or a Pakistani surgeon coming in his country. But those are usually not coming up in quantities sufficient to change the demographic makeup of a country. Even though the huge number of Eastern European immigrants is often considered the reason for Brexit, sociological research presented in the amazing book White Shift by Eric Kaufmann shows that people were always more concerned about non-European immigration into the UK. I would say that since Eastern Europeans are white, there is much less sensitivity towards expressing negative opinions about them on the media side, which might lead people to express their negative views more. This next bit is just my personal experience, but I have yet to meet a Western European who would be content with the situation in his country regarding immigration. I have spoken with French, Swedish, British and Dutch people, and all of them saw the situation regarding the impacts of mass immigration as a significant issue in their respective homelands. An older French lady, who drove me in BlaBlaCar near Marseille, told me that police would not come into her neighborhood if she called them. She was among the few remaining ethnically French people living in the area. To me, that is just a complete failure of the French state in its most basic role, to provide security to its citizens. I heard similar stories from the Swedish person I talked to. Sweden is a fascinating case, since there was a project by the Social Democracy to build 1 million new homes in Sweden in the 1960s and the 1970s. A massive amount of these homes were built, but the problem was that Swedes did not want to live there. They preferred to live in houses, and the new apartments were commie blocks of sort. So, there was a huge empty neighborhood of cookie-cutter apartment buildings around every larger Swedish town. When the immigrants started pouring in, since Sweden opened its door to every big wave of refugees since the Yugoslav wars, they all had where to go. But it resulted in almost complete segregation between ethnic Swedes and the newcomers. Sweden is probably in the most peculiar situation of all the Western European countries regarding immigration. I already mentioned the book White Shift by Eric Kaufmann. It is a fascinating book dealing with mass immigration, ethnic change in Western countries, and their projections to the future. Since Kaufman is partially white, partially Chinese, and partially Jewish, he can get away with ideas that would quickly lead to being labeled as a racist or a white supremacist if presented by other authors. There are several theses in his book. He openly says that the ethnic and cultural interests of the native populations are legitimate and should be considered by the political class. By ethnic and cultural interests, he means the right of the natives to influence the pace of the ethnic change of their surroundings. If the mainstream political class does not consider this cultural and ethnic interest, it will be channeled by other, more nefarious ways. He also prescribes the rise of the populist parties across the West precisely to this phenomenon. So, the rapid ethnic change of Western countries. It also creates a distinct new identity within the broader national identity of Western Europeans. The identity of a white British person, a white Dutch person, a white Swedish person, and so on. Historically, there was no need to connect the word British, Dutch, German, or Sweden with the adjective white, since it was obvious, and almost every British, Dutch, German, or Swedish person was white. But as the demographics change and the number of non-white inhabitants of Western Europe countries increases, these identities will inevitably be created by default, since the immigrants and their descendants will have distinct cultural identities, even if they would be integrated into the broader national identity. Based on population projection models, Kaufman predicts that in most northwestern European countries, people of European origin will get under 50% of the population during the second half of this century. In the 22nd century, a new mixed-race majority will rise in Western European countries. Kaufman's models work with the presumption that native fertility rates will remain sub-replacement, there will not be a complete or almost complete halt in immigration, and that immigration from Eastern Europe will lower as the Eastern European countries develop economically and suffer from significant demographic decline. By default, he concludes that since Eastern Europe is the only part of the world with sufficient amounts of white people poor enough to emigrate, the immigration streams to Western Europe will be from non-European sources. Sure, every projection can turn out completely wrong. Since birth rates can increase, there can be a sharp drop in the number of immigrants entering Europe, and there could be, for example, a huge wave of immigrants coming from Eastern Europe, since there could be war, for example. Eric Kaufman's vision is fundamentally optimistic, since he predicts that the new mixed-race majority will accept the defining characteristics of the former native nations. The mixed ethnicity people, most often with ethnically native component, are the fastest growing ethnic group in most Western European countries, and it is thus quite likely that the identity of people stemming from this mixing might be a synthesis of the native population's national identity with elements of the most prominent immigrant groups in each country. But this scenario is far from being certain. If the native majorities feel that their share of the population is declining too rapidly, while the newcomers are not integrating into the majority culture, it could lead to ethnic and cultural conflicts and ugly outbursts of violence and political upheaval, potentially leading to Lebanonization of certain countries. He thus promotes slowing of the immigration and creation of point systems based on combination of cultural and educational criteria that would prefer certain groups of immigrants over others. For example, members of groups that proved to be more prone to integration over members of chronically problematic groups. Immigrants are not a monolith, and there is a significant variety among different immigrant groups in Western European countries. Hindus in Britain are often very well off, which partially stems from the fact that many of the Hindu immigrants to Britain were members of middle-class Hindu communities in British colonies in Africa. French of the Berber descent from the Kabylie region in Algeria identify more with the French state and are less religious. So, there is a variety to be applied. For example, certain groups of immigrants marry out of their group much less than others. For example, immigrants of Pakistani descent in Britain marry out of their group very little, which negatively influences the probability of creating a new mixed ethnicity with a combination of identities. In another of his books, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth?, Kaufman researches the population projections for European Muslims. In the introduction of this video, I talked about the overblown expectations of many people about the proportion of Muslims in Europe in the future. For Western Europe to be completely Islamized, as many fear, there would have to be either a new wave of tens of millions of Muslim immigrants coming in, massive conversion of non-Muslims to Islam, or a departure of the non-Muslim population. Kaufman, including projected birth rates, immigration and conversion rates, projects the Muslim population of most Northwestern European countries to be between 10 and 15% in 2050, while in Sweden it will likely reach between 20 and 25%. In 2100, the Muslim population of most Western European countries will be between a quarter and a third of their populations. While not a majority, it is still a proportion that might unrecognizably change the face of these countries. Native populations have the right not to want the ethnic makeup of their countries altered by mass immigration. To want to live in a culturally and ethnically homogeneous country and community is not immoral. Researchers suggest that most people want exactly that. Preference for what is close and similar to you does not equal hate for others. But the inhabitants of most Western European countries lost that right forever, without the issue even being openly and adequately discussed with them. The social cohesion and impersonal trust within the countries of Western Europe were significantly negatively altered in the process. Nations and national identities are built around the collective cherishing and respecting a set of symbols, customs and narratives. When a significant chunk of the population does not share the belief in these narratives and potentially share different ones, it creates a potential for friction and conflict. Countries of Northwestern Europe have, up to now, been what is called high trust societies. That means there is a high level of impersonal trust, usually measured by the positive answer to questions like, can the average person be trusted? Countries where most people answered positively are wealthier, less corrupt, and happier on average. The impersonal trust is inevitably lessened by mass immigration because the impersonal trust stems from the subconscious belief that the stranger the question asked about is very similar to you. Thus, you can presume that he will think and act roughly the same as you would. That is very hard in an ethnically and culturally diverse country. Researchers prove that people are significantly less prone to contributing to welfare states via taxes if the population of the state becomes more ethnically diverse. Like it or not, we are just much more okay with our taxpayers' money going to help someone who we perceive as similar to us. Progressives love to say that diversity is a strength, but history offers very little evidence for this statement. Usually, more diverse countries are less successful and more prone to inner conflict than more homogeneous ones. If one watches the frequent youth street parties turned into spontaneous riots and fights with police in Germany, orchestrated collective vandalism in Italy, in both times perpetrated mostly by the youth of immigration background, or the wave of emigration of French Jews to Israel because of their fear of antisemitism, it is hard not to conclude that the development is not going in the right direction, since many of these manifestations openly mock and disrespect the state, its symbols, and law enforcement forces. It just does not look as if the youth growing up in the contemporary ethnic neighborhoods around and in Paris, Malmö, Birmingham, Brussels, or Berlin identifies with the symbols and narratives cherished by the native population. How this will affect the future development of the nations and their behavior and inner cohesion in a state of a crisis is one of the crucial questions of European politics in this century. The future is not set in stone, and it might go both ways. There is a Western European state that is approaching these issues with care and cool head, and that state is Denmark. The Danish Socialist Party won elections in 2019 with one of the harshest anti-immigration programs in the developed world. Measures against the creation of no-go zones by limiting the number of residents of non-Western origin in any neighborhood to 30%, or plans of deporting Syrian refugees back to Syria, looks like they came from a different, more rational planet in the context of Western Europe. Population of Denmark is also still 86% ethnically Danish, which is also unique within Northwestern Europe. The Prime Minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen, stated, quote, "For me, it is becoming increasingly clear that the price of unregulated globalization, mass immigration, and the free movement of labor is paid for by the lower classes." End of quote. If you were to bet if Denmark, with the policies mentioned above, or Sweden, with several decades of open border policy and a Pikachu meme face when the problems started to mount, will be in better condition a couple of decades later, who would you bet on? Mass immigration into Europe is a massive, unpredictable and costly social experiment. It could all work out in the end, but it also might not. The only thing at stake is the future of countries undertaking this risk. I am for once glad that the governments of my homeland have not started to roll the dice yet.